Hello, everyone. I think. Hello, everyone. I'm Yasser Munif, and I am based in Boston. I would like to welcome you to this panel titled Jailed Revolutionary Resistance to Assad's Prisons and Carceral System. And I would like to thank the organizers of for this panel, Robin Jones and Razan Ghazawi and Sarah Ajliaqin, who is streaming in the backstage. So thank you so much for organizing this very important panel. And I also would like to thank the sponsors for this panel. We have the New Politics, the Alliance for the MENA Socialist, the Global Campaign for Solidarity and with the Syrian Revolution, the SOAS Syria Society, and the Global Campaign for Prison Abolition. So thank you so much for sponsoring this panel. A few housekeeping items before we start the panel. This panel will be streaming on YouTube and Facebook, and there will be time for questions and answer at the end. So if you have questions, please post them on YouTube or Facebook, and we will try to address them at the end of the panel. This panel is part of a series of 11 webinars about the Syrian Revolution, a history from below. And there were a number of panels that we started back in June that addressed a number of topics from grassroots movement, the Kurdish movements for liberation, feminist politics, and the Syrian Revolution, and geopolitics, and the question of the political economy of the Syrian Revolution, and so on and so forth. So if you are interested and you missed some of the panels, you can see them. They are available on YouTube or on our website, and you will see the link is on scrolling right now on the screen. So the goal of this series and this webinar is to address the complexity and the depth of the Syrian Revolution, and think about the contradictions and the pitfalls of the Syrian Revolution now after 9 years of rebellions against the Assad regime. And it pushes against the narrative that what is happening in Syria is simply a civil war or a proxy war. Unfortunately, this is oftentimes what the mainstream media and some commentators and some experts have a tendency to do, which is to reduce the Syrian revolution to one aspect, either the proxy war or the intervention, or that there are conspiracies against Syria because Syria is supposed to be part of the anti-imperialist camp. So this webinar series pushes against that and tries to give a voice to people who were on the ground, activists, intellectuals, organizers, people who were actively involved in the Syrian revolution, either by writing or by supporting or by organizing the grassroots movement from below. And it tries to highlight that aspect of the Syrian revolution. And this panel is also in that same tradition of giving a voice to the people who are silenced, who are not necessarily in the mainstream media. The prison system in Syria is not necessarily what the mainstream media has a tendency to report on. There is one final panel after this current one, and it's titled "Where Next for the Syrian Revolution." This is the last panel, the 11th panel, and it will discuss some of the upcoming period, the strategies, the learned lessons from the Syrian Revolution. It will discuss the grassroots movement and politics with 4 terrific speakers: Ziad Majid, Karam Nashar, Marcel Shahwaru, and Wendy Perlman. So I am honored to be moderating this panel today. I think this is an extremely important topic. The prison system in Syria has a very long history that can be traced back to the Ottoman and the French period. That's when the prison system was put in place, was erected. But it went through a new phase with the Syrian regime, when the Syrian regime took power in 1963 as the Ba'ath Party, and then in 1970 as Assad, the father, Hafiz Assad. And it became really a pillar of the Syrian regime. It is one of the most important institutions in Syria. Those who have never lived in Syria have a hard time really imagining the importance of this institution, because it's an institution that is the foundation of the politics of fear and the politics of terror in Syria. And it colonized all spaces in the Syrian society. And it's very, very difficult to really highlight the importance of this institution, because it's oftentimes there is a blackout. It's very difficult to leak any stories or narrative from the prison system. So today we are really honored to have two outstanding speakers to speak about this very important institution, and to explain the importance of that institution and the carceral system and the prison in the Syrian revolution before, during, and after, the different phases it went through and how it evolved during the revolt. The first speaker is Wafa Mustafa, and she is one of the youngest members of the Family for Freedom, a survivor from detention, and an activist and journalist from Siaf, a city in the Hama Governorate in western Syria. Mustafa left the country on July 9th, 2013, exactly a week after her father was arrested by the authorities in Damascus. Mustafa moved to Turkey and began reporting on Syria for various media outlets. And in 2016, she moved to Germany and continued her interrupted studies in Berlin, where she lives now, and where she studies art and aesthetic at Bard College. And she is, her advocacy, Mustafa covers the impact of detention on young girls and women and families. And we'll hear from her today and her story in Syria and Berlin. And she'll explain the importance of her organizing and struggle in both countries. We also have Rateb Sha'bo, who was born in Latakia in 1963 and was arrested during the third year of his time in college studying veterinary medicine in Damascus. In 1994, Rateb was presented to the National Security Court in Damascus and was sentenced for 15 years in prison, and was finally released in 1999. He then continued his education after prison and specialized in otorhinology surgery, and worked in his clinic in Syria until 2014, when he left to France as a political asylum seeker. He published 2 books on the political aspect of the Prophet Muhammad, religious call, and he has a novel based on the prison experience. And he recently released a book on the history of the Communist League or the Communist Action League in Syria, one of the Communist party that was banned in Syria. So thank you so much for joining us and for this discussion on prison today in Syria. And I will leave the floor for Rateb Sha'bo to give a short talk about his story and the prison. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Yasser. I'm glad to be with you. In fact, as we speak before an Occidental audience, almost Occidental audience, we have to define our words, because the definitions of the words are not the same between the Occidental culture and the culture of our society, because there's a great difference. As I witnessed when I was in prison, during my long period in prison, the human rights organizations and the human rights activists, who were all Occidental, or almost all Occidental, always demanded the Assad regime to put forward accusations and to bring us to trial, because they understand the trial as they know it in their societies and in their culture. And when that was happened, in fact, for me, after 11 years of prison, I realized, and all my friends also realized, that the trial is not better than the martial law, or even it was worse. So I need to define my words. When we speak of prisons, when we speak of incarceration, in Syria, we have to understand that this system, this security politics from the part of Assad regime is a kind of mass destruction against the social resistance. When you put an innocent person in prison, as is done always during the black period of Assad regime, this is not a mistake. It is a kind of security policy to it's a message to the society that everyone is under risk of arrestation. So the putting an innocent people in prison.
Rateb, may I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
I think there is some white noise in the background, so I'm going to mute you and see if the microphone, and also log you out and in to see. Could you speak now?
Yes. I was saying.
Yeah,
okay?
This is much better. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So the meaning of incarceration under Assad regime means terrorizing the society, the whole society. There are no rules. They don't put the rule breakers in prison. It's not the case. They want to put all the society in a terrorized situation. So there's a verse in Al-Quran that says, who kills a person unjustly, as if he has killed the whole mankind. So the same is applicable here to understand what means the prison in Syria. In this regard, the political power tries to, from the one hand, to terrorize the society, and from the other hand, it has to justify its policy. And in this regard, what do Assad regimes, what does Assad regime do? He, in this regard, it behaves within two levels. The first is directed toward the regime itself, because, as we know, the political power is not a monolith. There are many rifts, many fissures inside the regime. So the regime every now and then sends security officers to the prisons. They meet the prisoners, who are not criminals, of course, and all they have done is to separate themselves against the will of the regime, political power. So the regime sends its officers to prisons to meet the prisoners, and they demand them one thing: if you are ready to be informant to our security apparatus, you can leave. And of course, they depend on the dignity of the prisoners that they will not accept, because that kind of demand humiliates them. So they refuse. And when they refuse, they say to the party, even to the families of the prisoners, we want to let them out, but they insist to be in prison. So this kind of policy is directed, from the one hand, to the part of the political party, political power, and from the second hand, to the society as a whole, to give a picture of the political power, that it cares of prisoners. It tries to let them out, but they don't want to go out. It's a joke, but that kind of policy worked for all the last period, at least in the period that I was in prison. So I want to add another and final thing. The system of prisons in Syria during the Assad regime is not homogeneous. We have many grades. So after the first phase, which is interrogation, this is the most horrible period for every prisoner in Syria. They send the prisoners to prisons which are not the same. The difference between the prisons are great, to the level that when I was transferred to Tadmor prison, or Tadmor Hill, we can say, Palmyra, I found that the difference between Tadmor prison and Adra prison was almost almost at the difference between other prison and the freedom. So we have 10,000 of prisoners, but they are not in the same situation. They divide the prisoners according to their policy, according to their parties. So this kind of differentiation you can see between the prisoners is not visible for the human rights activists. So the prisoners in general for them are prisoners and full stop. But the fact is there is a great difference between the situations in prisoners in prisons, and that I wanted to emphasize on this point, because I suffered from it, and I noticed that the human rights activists and organizations don't notice this this great difference and this effective difference. That's all, Yasser. Thank you. صوتك مو مسموع يا ياسر، صوتك مو مسموع. شيل الميوت.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much, Rateb. That was a really important narrative that is not often voiced. I also wanted to emphasize for our viewers who are not necessarily familiar with Syrian history and the prison system in Syria that Tadmor prison that you mentioned in your talk and where you spent some time is notorious as one of the most brutal prisons in the entire region and even beyond, where there was a very major massacre of prisoners in 1980 and 1982. And as you said, there is a whole gradation of different prisons in Syria. And the most recently, obviously, Sednaya has become the most lethal, where people disappear and lose their life. So I will return to you with some question. I would like now to go to Wafa. Thank you, Wafa. Wafa, you are an activist and a journalist and a member of the Family for Freedom, and you have been active in representing the cause of Syrian detainees and political prisoners for several years now. Your father has disappeared, according to your last social media days count, in 2,585 days. Would you give us an idea about activism in this field and what you've been involved in, and what are some of the challenges that you faced? And thank you for participating in this panel.
Thank you, Yasser. And yeah, well, such a difficult question. It's never easy to talk about anything, whether it's our own stories or what we do or our life, our daily lives. But let me start by saying this. So on the 2nd of July, 2013, my father, Ali Mustafa, was forcibly disappeared from our house in Damascus. The story goes, long story short, it goes like this. So at that point, we actually, as you mentioned, thank you, we come from Masyaf, a small town near the city of Hama. And I was in Damascus studying journalism in media. And when the revolution started, I participated in a call for a strike called the Dignity Strike. and accordingly, I didn't continue my studies. And then with time passing, actually, my dad's situation in Masyaf became more complex. So at some point, by the end of 2012, he decided to move to Damascus. And so he was staying with me and my younger sister, Sana. And then, yes, at some point in beginning of July 2013, I was in Masyaf visiting my mom and my youngest sister, Rina, and then my dad and my mom weren't meeting for a while, so he suggested that they meet, that she comes to Damascus. And obviously at that point, my mom didn't really like traveling, because what used to be a 3 hours trip from Masyaf to Damascus became something like 8 hours trip, many checkpoints, a lot of stress and stuff. So she didn't really prefer to. But then my dad convinced her and said that they have like our house in Damascus for themselves, and then they can just spend some time together. So what my mom did is that she cooked his favorite food and prepared some of his clothes and went to Damascus. So before she arrived, and I'm mentioning, I actually emphasize these details because, because these details what make our stories more difficult, and also, but they also make them more real. So my mom called my dad 15 minutes before she got arrived, and then she told him that she needs 15 minutes to be there. So he goes like, yes, I've cleaned the house and everything is ready for you, and I'm waiting for you. And 15 minutes later, she arrived and she called him and he never responded. Yes, I mean, we lived, our place was in Al Muhajirin neighborhood. So to those who don't know, this is the neighborhood where Assad himself lives, actually, with his family. Although we weren't there to know who exactly arrested or kidnapped my dad. We could actually guess, obviously, because the neighborhood is under the regime's control. And but one of the neighbors told my mom that a group of armed men broke into the house, and she heard noise, and then she saw them coming downstairs with my dad, and that was the last time we've heard from him. And that was 7 years ago. So I was active before my dad got arrested, obviously. I come from, I would say, a liberal political family. I used to go to my dad. As a family, we used to go actually on a trip every week to Damascus from Masyaf to participate in protests, supporting the Palestinian cause, and at some point supporting what has been happening in Iraq. And so this whole demonstrations culture wasn't new, completely, at least new for me. It was something that I've been living for years. Obviously, the settings were completely different, but this is why when the revolution started, it wasn't a question for me. I always say that I don't really remember the first protest for Syria, of the Syrian revolution, because it wasn't something that I thought about and decided to do. It was just something that I just found myself there. And I know that many people had the same experience. So I was active before my dad got arrested, and partially I always say that I was active, obviously, because I was raised in this house. I was raised with this family. I was raised with my dad, who always talked about politics, even though walls have ears in Syria. We always heard discussions, and even between my dad and my mom. My dad was always, as all dads in Syria, was always watching the news and stuff. So everything I've been through led me to the point where it was no question for me to go and protest, and I was aware of the results, just like everyone else. But when my dad got arrested, it wasn't only it was a collapsing moment for me, and not only because my dad was arrested, but because before that I lost one of my best friends. I mean, like all Syrians, I've lost many friends, either in detention, or some of them got killed by bombing, or so it was a huge moment for me. The question how I became active, or how it's not something that I actually also like decided to do. It's not, I don't think of what I'm doing as an activism. It is obviously it is, but it's just that this is how things worked for me. When we first fled, it was me, my mom, and my youngest sister, who was 13 at that point, and we had to flee illegally because at that point mothers were not allowed to leave the country with underage kids without the allowance of the fathers. So with my dad being just disappeared, we had to flee illegally to Turkey, and this is another stage of uncertainty. We just went to Turkey with nothing except for our passports, with no support, with no family, without knowing anyone, with the help of someone we knew through someone. We got to the city of Mersin, and then everything started there. To be honest, where I am now, at this point, where I am going to Coplands, going to, I don't know, to the UN Security Council, this wasn't a plan. At the beginning, I took my time to actually collapse. I did, and it wasn't easy for me. When I first fled to Turkey, I was very depressed. I kept visiting the hospital on weekly basis almost. I couldn't find any. It was too much for me to handle. My dad being disappeared, and most importantly, fleeing Syria was that I guess the thing that made everything worse. So for like 2-3 years, I was obviously I had to work, and this is something I might talk about later, but I wasn't active then in this sense. I was only working to support my family financially, but I was depressed, and it wasn't easy for me. I wasn't sure that I wanted to be alive anymore. But after 3 years, I realized that I came actually to the point where I thought that, okay, so obviously this is not working for me. Collapsing is, I collapsed, but that's it. This is not something that I want to keep doing or keep living. So I started doing something else. And then when I came to Germany, I came to study, and then 2 years earlier, 3 years ago, I actually joined Families for Freedom. So to those who don't know about Families for Freedom, it's a women-led movement whose family members are all arrested, detained, kidnapped, or disappeared, either by, not only by Assad regime. This is one thing that I would always like to emphasize, either by Assad regime, by ISIS, by HTS, Jaish al-Islam, SDF, anyone, any armed or any kind of groups who use detention as a weapon to terrorize civilians. So we are a group of women who actually do a lot to, and this is something I will also talk about later maybe, but our main goal and our main, the reason of our existence of and of our being us all together is that we are demanding the release of our loved ones. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Wafa, for such a powerful story about your father and about your activism and about your journey from Syria to Turkey to Germany. I mean, this is a narrative that is not often heard, unfortunately, and it's not easy to tell that story, obviously. And I see that you are also very emotional because it's also part of the trauma that you and many families have to go through. And I think you've just recently commemorated the 7th anniversary of his disappearance. Is that right? Yeah. So 7 years. What to say? Yeah, and I wanted also to show some of the pictures and have you comment on some of them, because I think we see you on some of them. So if we could show some of the pictures.
Well, yes, maybe I can talk briefly about this one and maybe the trial. So this is outside the courthouse in Koblenz, the city of Koblenz in Germany, where the first trial of two former Syrian officials is happening, and it is those who are charged with state-sponsored torture, and it is actually happening under the principle of universal jurisdiction. And when it started, I guess the first hearing was 23rd, I believe, of April, and so actually I was following the news of the court and the trial, and even before it actually started, and I was thinking, you know, there was a huge media attention, and it is obviously a huge step, but it took me a few days to come to the point where I decided to go there. And I thought that obviously this is a huge moment for all Syrians. So not only for detainees, for everyone. And this is also a crucial moment in the history of the Syrian revolution. And the media was talking about justice being achieved and stuff. And I was as like everyone else, that was very emotional for me, but I was also confused. And I thought, okay, so I believe that I should go there and be part of this experience, but I didn't want to go alone. So I thought, because I thought that those who most deserve to be there and witness this moment are the detainees, those who actually suffered and still suffering from torture. And so I went there, not only with my dad's picture, but with photos of 61 other detainees. Some of them, their families, unfortunately, were told that they got killed in prisons. Some, like my dad's case, their families know nothing about them, not even if they are alive or not. And it was a huge experience for me, actually, on all levels. I mean, I guess on a political level, it was also a huge step, because I was there to say that we are not only, as families of detainees, we are not only trying to tell our stories and keep it to this emotional level, where actually we are being somehow we are being pushed to only talk about the detainees on an emotional level, as if we are not like, we cannot be active, or we cannot be activists, and as if those detainees are not actually in prison because of political acts and political backgrounds. So I thought that the trial was very important, and a very important platform also to emphasize and highlight and bring more attention to the issue of detainees in Syria. And being there is like, as a physical experience, was huge. Being in the courthouse is crazy. It felt like at one point I couldn't even know if this is actually happening. You know, like I was detained myself, and I was brought in front of a court, but that was completely different. I saw Anwar Rislan and Ayad Al-Gharib, those who are actually accused of cases of torture and killing under torture and deprivation of freedom. And I saw them there sitting. They look very healthy. They wear masks. They have someone translating for them. It is very emotional, and it was a crucial experience for me, because I was, at that point, I was sure that yes, now more than ever I can actually tangibly know what justice means, because justice for us has always been this very very, I don't know, like absurd somehow concept that we all demand justice, but I never know actually what I this is not something that I can actually describe. So it was the moment where I was like, okay, I'm sure now when I say that I want Anwar Islam to get a fair and just trial, I'm sure that actually I mean it. And I'm sure that this what actually will allow us to build a future for Syria. And this is a huge step for Syria. And I guess that I wish that I really wish that all Syrians and everyone who wish to go there, that they can go there and witness this I don't know, very important experience.
Thank you so much, Wafa, for this powerful narrative and also heartbreaking story. Oftentimes, people who talk about Syria and try to defend the Syrian regime because the Syrian regime is anti-imperialist, cares about Palestine, and so on, they often have nothing to say about the prison system. They celebrate the Syrian regime for being secular and for caring about women's rights and doesn't impose the veil. They don't speak about what women go through in the prison system, which is a horrifying story, obviously. And the Riyad Turk has used the term "the kingdom of silence" to describe exactly the prison system, which is the foundation of the Syrian regime. And without understanding the prison system in Syria, it's almost impossible to really understand what is happening in Syria. Thank you. I want to go back to Rateb now, and go back to your description of the Syrian system, the Syrian prison. You are a doctor, and as you mentioned, you spent 16 years in prison. And you are also a journalist and have published a number of articles regarding the Syrian situation and the Syrian revolution. Could you please talk a little bit about the Assad political prison system And what are the differences between the prison system in Syria and elsewhere? What are some of the specificity of the of prison in Syria compared to other places? Because oftentimes people have a tendency to picture prison in the US and use it at least for the US audience. They have a tendency to generalize the prison experience in the US as the same elsewhere. So if you could talk a little bit about the specificity of the Syrian prison.
Okay, thank you, Yasser. In fact, to compare the Assad regime or the Syrian state with the state of France or Germany or any other state, democratic state, is like to compare cold with cancer. The two are diseases, but the difference is very clear. I know that the pro-Assad intellectuals resort to these kinds of comparisons. In fact, nothing can be compared. As for the Assad regime and its characteristics, we can speak about the superimposing the social divisions, I mean the communities, on the political divisions. So the regime uses all the divisions in the society to enhance itself and to dure forever. This is clear, but what is characteristic is the regime humiliates the reason and the logic of the Syrians. You can notice that when the regime forces his people, whether they are with him or against him, they are obliged to go to streets and to speak slogans highly in his favor. When he forces people to say Al-Assad ila al-abad, Assad forever, even the child understands that this is absurd. It's not logic. The regime insists on this slogan. Why? Just to humiliate the people. To tell everyone that we can do everything. We can make you like mad people, like idiots. So this characteristic can't be found anywhere else. This is from the maybe from the psychological side of the subject. But from the political side, you can find that the Assad regime deteriorate all the concepts of politics. So he is against imperialism and with imperialism. He is against Israel and with Israel. He can bring the prisoners to trial and deteriorate and devastate their lives at the same time, and by the means of trials. So, to understand this kind of regimes, you have to get out of the ordinary concepts that the intellectuals use to understand a state or a regime or a political situation. When we're in prison, I was in a communist party. The regime brought us before a trial. In what accusation? He accused us of being against socialism, against liberty, and against unification of Arab world. You can't find absurdity like this. And the human rights activists were there. They visited the building where we tried. And I am sure they couldn't understand anything. This is a trial. There are 3 judges in front of you. There are 4 or 5 advocates. And this is a trial. What do you want else? Accusations, verdict, but the essence, the indication, I don't know what to say. The meaning of the trial is absolutely absent. It's absolutely a form without any content. And for the Western states, Western politicians, Western activists, okay, it's a trial. And there are advocates. So this regime, in fact, as the English say, it's neither fish nor flour. You have to structure your concepts in order to understand it. In this case, I appreciate all the thinkers or the writers or the journalists who go to the nature of this regime by an original thinking, to put aside all what they know, all the commonplace concepts, and go directly to understand a very extraordinary regime. That was what we need to. A writer like Salwa Ismail, she wrote a book, the Role of Violence in Syria. So she used an expression which is very original, the pedagogy of violence. This regime uses the memory as a tool of government. And so it's a unique kind of regimes of states of extraordinary political powers.
Thank you. I mean, as you said, what defines the regime in a certain way is the slogan that you mentioned, Assad for eternity. And the other slogan is Assad or we burn the country. This is really what defined the Assad regime. Without understanding that dimension and the role that violence plays in the Syrian system or Syrian society, it's impossible to really understand the anatomy of the Syrian regime. I wanted also to mention that I asked you to compare the US system with the Syrian prison system, not to minimize the violence that people incarcerated in the US undergo. Obviously, there is tremendous violence against mostly people of color, but also others. But to also be able to look and distinguish the differences and the specificity of each one of those systems that are not similar. So I want to go back to Wafa, and thank you, Rateb, for this really important description. Wafa, I want to go back to your relationship with political voices. So aside from the documentation and the human pleas, what representation is there for families and released prisoners? And how do political voices deal with them? Do they encourage them to participate, or do they feel that they are being co-opted? And how important is engaging them politically? If you could talk a little bit about that aspect of the relationship.
Well, I guess this is a very important and very crucial question, and it is a very difficult one, because at least, I mean, now as a member of Families for Freedom for 2 years, it feels like movements such as Families for Freedom who actually do not only go and first we're all women. We are all families of detainees and disappeared. So it feels like we do not fit where politicians and decision makers want us to fit. So we are mostly invited to cover the emotional aspect of being a family of being families of detainees, and this is very important, and this is something we actually do because we are aware of its importance, but we are minimized. Like, our role is minimized actually on a political level. Our role is minimized to this point. So it happened many times that I'm invited to events where I'm asked to only talk about the emotional or psychological struggle or suffering of families of detainees, which is definitely valid, and it is part of my story and it is part of my life. But this is not the only thing I do. And as Families for Freedom, we actually campaign, advocate, and work on all possible levels. So we definitely try to lobby and campaign amongst the families of detainees in Syria, regardless of whether their loved ones were detained by Assad or by ISIS or any kind of other groups. So we are campaigning and advocating on this level. We are also as we are scattered all over the world, so we are also aware of the importance of approaching the public in our hosting communities. So we do events, different formats, demonstrations, discussions. As it show in one of the picture, we have the Freedom Bus. where we have pictures of detainees, and we go there. And this picture was from 2 years ago, 2018, in Berlin. This is the Brandenburger Tor, a very famous site in Berlin. So we actually approach the public in many different ways, because we are aware that they have a very important role, that they can pressure their politicians. What we do actually is not only that we, through telling our stories, we introduce, as you said, this nature of detention in Syria that is not very clear for everyone. So mostly I'm asked if I call my dad, and I understand where does this come from, but so we are aware that this is something we should actually pay attention to. So we talk, we try different, we use different means to explain what it means to be detained or to lose someone in detention in Syria. Beside that, we also address politicians and decision makers. So the fact that we actually last year, two colleagues of mine, Amina Kholani and Hala Al-Ghawi, addressed the UN Security Council, and this year I addressed the UN Security Council, happened because of all the efforts that Families for Freedom have been making for the past few years. Since its forming in 2017, we've been all trying to do this. We are not a political movement, yes, and we are not a political group, but we are aware of we do a lot on all levels, and we are also active on a political level. We are aware of the importance of us as families of detainees being part of each and every process regarding justice, accountability, negotiations. So usually we are, to be honest, not very. We are not taking seriously as a political actor in any process. And most of the times there is talk about the conflict between the humanitarian aspect of detention and the political one. And I believe that not only Families for Freedom, obviously the Caesar Families Association, the Sednaya Association, many groups and many people are actually doing so. We are, even if we are not invited, we go there. I mean, no one invited me to go to Koblenz, but we go there because we know that this trial would have not been able to actually happen without all the survivors and the families of detainees who spoke up and said that, yes, we're going to do this. So it's not easy, actually. It's not something, it's not like our role is preserved and we just go there and do what we do. We actually fight to be there. And it's not easy. This is another level that we have also to fight on, but this is what we do, and it is very important. It doesn't make any sense to do any kind of any political or humanitarian, whatever you call it, processes regarding Syria without families of detainees being there and speaking up their opinions and their suffering, not the way politicians want them to do it, but the way we actually live it, the way we are doing it.
Thank you so much, Wafa, for talking about this important process. Oftentimes, the question of detainees and the disappeared is used as a bargaining chip by politicians, and they're not necessarily viewed as an important dimension of the struggle. in many cases, many countries that underwent civil wars and conflict, oftentimes they disappeared, and the people who were killed during the conflict are forgotten as part of a deal of reconciliation between the different parties. So your struggle is extremely important, imposing yourself as part of the larger struggle of the Syrian. Oftentimes, again, to go back to the anti-imperialists who love to mention and talk about stability in Syria before and so on, they forget to mention that this stability was at a very high cost, that there were many, many people who were disappeared and were in prison. And currently there are more than 100,000 people who are in prison. And obviously those are not part of the equation. People say, let's go back to stability. Yes, but what about those people and their families and their loved ones? So I want to go back to Rateb and ask a question about, since you spent a lot of time in, as you mentioned, different prisons, Tadmor and Adra, I believe. If you could talk a little bit about the different stages of incarceration and how this process also changed before and after 2011. There is a lot of literature in Arabic, but it's not necessarily available in English for English audiences. There is a rich literature, either fiction or narrative or autobiographies about ex-prisoners who wrote about the question. And there was also a question about, let's see if we can get it on the screen, about the massacre of Hama. If you could also talk about that aspect, which I think that was before you were in Hama. So I will read the question. I would like to ask about the importance of the Hama massacre in the formation of the consciousness of the Syrian political prisoners to a period before the revolution, and how that informed your consciousness and your experience since you spent time in Tadmor prison where that massacre occurred.
Yes. First of all, I will speak of the massacre of Hama. It was a turning point in the political life in Syria, I think, because it showed that the regime is ready to go very far in its oppression. So Hama is demolished, but the memory of Hama is always alive. So what Hama means for all the Syrians now is the memory of Hama as a punishment to every city, every part of the country that will stand against this regime. In 1996, I was transferred to Tadmor prison, and I found the where the Islamist prisoners were put, and I found their traces, I can say, on the walls of the rooms, and how they tried to accommodate or to live in these very hard conditions. I think all the world must know that the prisoners in Tadmor tortured on daily basis for years. How can you imagine a person to tolerate this kind of daily torture. So when I remember the stories of these prisoners who were transferred from Palmyra to Adra, where I was, it was as if I was living in another world. Even we are the prisoners, we were prisoners in Adra. We couldn't imagine the situation in Palmyra. So the massacre of Hama and the prison of Palmyra represent the essence of this regime. We can do anything, and we are ready to do anything, and we are ready to oblige you to do anything. The most absurd thing you must be ready to do, otherwise you will be killed. For the prisoners and the kind of prisoners or the phases of incarceration in Syria, I mentioned the interrogation, which is a horrible phase. Now, under Bashar al-Assad, is much more horrific. At least when I was arrested, I was sure, I don't know why I was sure, but I was sure that I will not be killed. I will be tortured, and I was tortured. But I was sure that I will rest alive, at least. But now, everything is done with prisoners, abjection, starving, killing, violated. So it's not enough to say that someone is a prisoner, someone is a detainee, someone is absent. It's not enough. We must continue to describe what this means. The prisoner in anywhere in the world is not like the prisoner under Assad regime. Now the situation is catastrophic, and we can't. I have many friends that are in prison, and no one knows where are they. No one can visit them. No one can know if they are alive or dead. No one can know nothing. So I am now. I spent 16 years in prison, 16 years and 3 days to be precise. But I feel shame when I look to the pictures of Caesar, or the narratives of the survivors, because the situation now can't be described. So the degradation, I don't know the exact word, is needed to be analyzed. We must put aside all we know. We must go directly to the reality of what is happening in Syria, to understand that what is said as a regime is not a regime, is a gang, is something like mafia, something that can't be described as a state. So this is the reality of Syria and of its prisons, of the incarceration there.
Thank you, Rateb, for this very vivid depiction of what happened inside Syrian prisons and the different type of prisoners and the different gradation of prisons in Syria. I will add that again, the prison system in Syria is very different from elsewhere. Just to mention that the Syrian prison industrial complex or complex has many dimensions, like the one in the US, but it's different. For example, many prisoners fear the hospital in the military hospital in Damascus, 601, where they are often tortured and killed, and they lose their life. And those who go to that hospital oftentimes wish to go back to even Sednaya, the most atrocious prison, because their experience in the hospital is horrifying. And again, there are a lot of narratives and literature in Arabic. Unfortunately, those are not available in English, and I hope that in the coming years there will be translation and more interest in exposing the prison system in Syria. I recently wrote about prison in Syria, and as someone who had never had an experience inside prisons, I watched videos and I read narratives, and my experience was that for months and months I had nightmares. I was angry with my kids, and it's very difficult. It's traumatizing. I mean, to deal with the experiences of prisoners. And oftentimes prisoners in Sednaya and elsewhere wish to die as opposed to surviving in the conditions of the prison system. So I want to go back to Wafa again, and I would like to ask you about activism and what is to be done. What are the areas you feel activists, as much as friends and the community around prisoners, family, should be aware of? And here we have a question from Martin Raskolnikov. How can we help from Latin America? Thank you.
Thank you.
I will finish the question though. How do we contribute to the well-being and healing process of the families? And if you could talk about that process of being an activist and the healing process.
Well, yes. I mean, I'll answer to the question, which also, I mean, it answers to all the what can we do? I mean, all of us, Syrians, non-Syrians. And thank you, Martin, for the question. Well, I mean, most obvious thing is that we all need to educate ourselves. This includes Syrians. This includes even us as families of detainees, because the amount of information, the load of information from everyday's life in Syria is huge. So it's not easy actually to keep up with it. It's not easy to take it, because even on a psychological, emotional level, it is a lot. But to be able to help, most obvious thing is that we need to educate ourselves. We need to learn about what's going on. Why is it? I mean, to be honest, I believe that the war in Syria is a propaganda war. So even educating yourself now seems not very easy. If you are, even for Syrians, obviously, it seems like not a very easy thing to do, because the regime's propaganda is, I believe, is somehow, obviously, after 10 years, it seems quite strong. So we're not only trying to access information, we are trying to access a reliable and a trusted information. So this is not easy. So at least first is to find a trusted source to take information and then educate ourselves. And I believe that there is no like a catalog that that says what we all can do, but the things that are the easiest things is that talk about it. Talk about it with friends, talk about it with family, talk about it with people at university, at work, organize events, build this relationship. And this is something we are also trying to do, to build this relationship between what's going on, to link Syria, to connect Syria, and to connect our struggle to other struggles, because this what unifies us, and that's what makes us stronger. And so by meeting these women from Bosnia, for example, from Chile, from Lebanon, we are building a stronger, a more appealing case, a more appealing narrative for people to learn about and to support. So we can all be part of this process. I believe that most importantly, now we are fighting with the regime over narrative. We are at this point where history is being made. And after 10 years, it seems like the regime is, in some places, winning the narrative. So, for example, now there is a group of Syrians who are trying to emphasize and let people know and think and support the victims of chemical attack in Eastern Ghouta, which happened 7 years ago on the 21st of August. So this is something that we can all share, we can all talk about, we can all support. This is like the chemical attack on Ghouta or Idlib or other places is a huge thing. So Russia is fighting to prove that this is not true. Russia is fighting to say that white helmets are terrorists. So we are all part of this war over narrative. So we can all participate, but we can only participate if we have access to trusted sources and trusted information. So raise awareness. Talk about it. If you are, I don't know, if for example, if you are if you have power or some influence over any I don't know, maybe if you can vote. I mean, even voting is also something you can do, because obviously it's all connected. Syria is not separated from everything that is going on. 2 days ago at the UN Security Council, I was shocked by to be honest, at some point I felt that I am at the wrong place, because everyone is talking about some parties fighting over power, and let's all sit together and do a new constitution, and then everything is fine. And I was there, and I was completely lost at some point. I couldn't understand. It's not that I am there as a family of a detainee. How come that we are talking about constitutional committee as if it is the solution to what's going on in Syria and to the detainees issue, and this is happening at the UN Security Council? So it is crazy. It seems at some point that there's nothing we can do. Many times I feel helpless. I feel that there's nothing we can do, and this is something we all feel, and it is justified. But we keep fighting. I mean, each of us in their own ways. What people can. I mean, if let's see. If you are, how to support, this is a very tough question for me. I mean, how to support like detainees or families of detainees, health or psychological well-being. this is very, this needs like hours. This is something I, from my own experience, it's very difficult. I know that people are, this is something you cannot accept. You do not accept that your dad, your brother, your mother, your sister just went missing. This is something you do not accept. And if even, I always say that I'm 30 now, and in 50 years, if I'm 80, I will not forget at any point that I had a father like everyone else on the earth, and suddenly he just disappeared. This is something I cannot forget. This is something I cannot accept. This is something I cannot just be silent about. So I mean, being sensitive is crucial, obviously, but it is very complicated. This is, I'm not even sure if this is something I can answer to. I know that the more we learn, the more we listen, the more we try to understand, the more we help actually listening to, because it's obviously talking about talking about our lives, because this is my life now. This is my life. So talking about its details is not easy for me, but I know that I have a group, many of groups, actually not one group, of friends, of family, of women from Families for Freedom. We are all there to help. We are all there to listen. We try to understand the, I don't know, the complexity of the feelings, and we try to communicate, I guess. Yeah, this is actually everything now in my mind.
Thank you, Wafa, for sharing your experience and your powerful narrative and work with different organizations. As you said, I mean, this is really a battle between the Syrian regime trying to silence you and people like you who have parents and family inside Syrian prisons, and you exposing them and telling your own story, and it's difficult because oftentimes people don't necessarily have the patience for that, and they want to live their lives, and it's not necessarily a very happy story to tell, and there is this disconnect between what happens inside prisons and that relationship with the prisoner inside, and in some cases you don't really know much and you don't have much information and you have to live with that. And those who live outside. I wanted to also mention, since you talked about the similarity between different groups similar to yours who are struggling in their own societies, in their own countries, for the loved one, for the disappeared in their own countries. I am part of a coalition, and Wafa, you are also part of that coalition, the Global Prison Abolitionist Coalition. And that coalition really is about exposing the prison system in all countries and try to find some of the similarities between the prison system in these various societies, and see how we can work together to expose the violence of the state, whether that's in the US or France or Britain in the West, or Syria, or Ghana or Brazil and elsewhere. And in fact, there are many similarities. Prisoners need to get out of prison, especially in the context of COVID-19. And their struggle need to be explained to people. People need to understand what happens in prison. It's not about reforming. It's not about educating. It's about violence and trauma. And people need to understand that and make those connections and talk to people and listen to them. So thank you for sharing your story. I want to go back to Rateb, and I think this question is actually connected to what Wafa was describing, which is in some ways you spend a lot of time, obviously, in the Syrian prison, and in many cases people don't get out of Syrian prison, and that's the case especially today during the Syrian revolution. But in case they manage to get out of the prison, what shape and what do they have to go through? If you could describe the relationship of the prisoner who is released from, or released from prison, and the larger society. I know that in many cases, prisoners are not allowed to look at the prison guard. If they do, in some cases, they lose their life. They're not supposed to make eye contact with the prison guard. And because of that, they lose their ability to socialize with others because they are always looking on the ground. They're not supposed to make eye contact. And in some cases, they are moved, as you said, from Tadmur prison to Adra to be re-educated, to look in the eyes and be able to function in a normal way, and also to gain weight because they lose so much weight in prison like Palmyra or in Sednaya. And then they have to be spend a few months and gain few kilos or some weight, and then be released as part of this process of re-socialization. So if you could talk about that difficult process of the prisoners once they are released and they have to encounter the larger society.
Thank you, Yasser. In fact, in my case, I was released directly from Tadmor prison. So I was not rehabilitated before. Zero here without the mustache. In past, I had mustache, and in fact, terrified. But you know, the prisoners, when they are released, they are considered defeated, and this feeling is rooted in their psychological structure. So it's heavy for them to reconstruct their lives. In addition to that, the society is not much accepting because of the fear of the consequences. So in my case, I went to continue my university, and the difference in age was 16 years. In addition to that, the whole atmosphere, the whole political and cultural and moral, ethical atmosphere was different. So I was really out of place, but I could manage. And what is good is that many prisoners, many friends of me have wrote their experience, and this is good for the upcoming generations of Syria to know what happened to them. So we have many books about the prison, but they are not translated into English, unfortunately. I think only the book of Mustafa Khalifa, The Shell, I don't know if it was translated like this, The Shell. Okay. And I don't know if there is another one who was translated into English. My book is about our life in prison, what is behind these walls. In fact, it's not, I didn't want to make my book as a direct condemnation to the regime. It describes the life in prison as it was. I know the other friends have wrote their books to condemn the only purpose was to condemn the regime. The regime is deserved to be condemned a million times, but I think it's better to write about the life, how a person who is put in these conditions, how can he survive? How can he maintain his mental health, his body health? How can he contact with the real life when he is free? So I wrote my book in this meaning. In fact, as you know, there's a saying, an Arabic saying, as you are ruled, you know. So the public culture in Syria, the public conscience, we need a very hard work to be changed, to look at the state as a common establishment, and not as a divine, not as a god on earth that can do whatever it wants. So we need cultural struggle, political struggle. We need struggle, multi-dimension struggle.
Thank you for this really important perspective on Syrian prisons and the life of prisoners after the release, and the question of adapting to society after the release. And then the question of the literature on prison, and there are a number of books, as you mentioned. Unfortunately, many of them are not available in English. More recently, there were a number of translation. I think not enough. We need more. I want to go back to Wafa to ask you a little bit about, for a person who has listened to our conversation today, someone who's not necessarily versed very much in Syrian politics, or doesn't know many of the organization and who's who in the Syrian revolution and the activist world and so on. Could you talk a little bit about how someone could help the imprisoned families and member of families to get out, and if there are anything that people watching right now to support your struggle and the struggles of many others to get their loved one out of prison, to get information about them, how can they help in a nutshell?
Well, yes, another very difficult question. I believe that actually there is, and this is my somehow theory, there is nothing like that families of detainees can do this or must do this, and then other people must do this. We are all in this together. The fact that there are at least those who are documented according to the Syrian Network for Human Rights, 130,000 people. Sorry. So the fact that these people are not part of any talks about Syria's future, Syria's prisons, this means that none of us is going to go anywhere. There is no future for Syria if we don't talk about these people, if we all don't figure this out. What we can do, what everyone else can do, is what we are doing as families of detainees. I mean, I'm trying my best to do everything I can, but this is one thing that I also wanted to mention, that it's very important, and this is something I do in my daily life. It's very important to realize that this what we are living is very difficult. People have been living this for 5, 6, 7, 10 years. I cannot ask people to do more, or to not I don't know. I mean, many people just felt that we see them from distance, that they don't really maybe talk about it. They are trying to adopt and to fit where they are, and this is their right. This is something that, even when, like, I feel that I'm hesitant to ask anyone to do more, because it's not easy. I know for myself that this is very difficult. I cannot ask anyone to do more, especially if they are actually families of detainees, and even if they are not. This burden, this emotional, psychological burden, is applied to all of us. We are all living this. As I said, it is satisfying, and it is sometimes easy for people to ask what we can do. Give us instructions, 1, 2, 3. This is not the case in Syria. We've been campaigning, we've been advocating, we've been fighting, we've been trying everything we can for the past 10 years. And unfortunately, nothing has worked yet. It takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of energy. But if there's anything that people can do, we can do together. Every time I don't know, what I do, for example, on daily basis, is that I share information. I raise awareness through writing, through video, through whatever. I go to protests. I invite people to protests. I try to approach politicians. I try to approach public. I try to have discussions with people. This is the only thing we have. Actually, I believe that the only means we have now is our voice. And this doesn't only apply to me as a daughter of a detainee. This applies to the whole planet. The only means. This sounds a bit desperate, but the case of Syria is not very optimistic, unfortunately. But we should at least realize that our voice is our only means, or our main means, maybe now. So we should use it the way we believe is most helpful. So I believe that there's nothing such as like a magical solution to or maybe like a magical guideline where we can all like follow and then release detainees. Obviously it's not that. I wish it was like that, but it's not. And there's nothing that I can give to people to say that this is what you should do. But I ask everyone to do what they feel that they can do and they want to do. And the main thing is just to raise your voice and talk about it and just learn. And just, I mean, it's crucial to know that at this point, while we are speaking, people are getting detained in Syria. People are still being tortured and detained, although there is a trial in Germany prosecuting two former Syrian officials. But this doesn't mean that torture and mistreatment and detention has stopped. Nothing has stopped. It is still happening. What happened in Germany, the trial, is the result of countless efforts of Syrians and non-Syrians who all came together and raised their voices and said that we're going to do this. We're going to figure a way to prosecute these people. So there are ways, but none of us alone can find them. So we should all at least unite and come together and communicate and try our best. At least the least we can do is to speak about it.
Thank you, Wafa. I mean, I think this is so important. As I mentioned earlier, Riyad Turk dubbed Syria as the kingdom of silence. Silence is obviously the main and most important ally of the Syrian regime. And your voice and the voice of others who have a loved one in prison, exposing the crimes of the Syrian regime, exposing what's happening in the Syrian prison, trying to break that blackout that the Syrian regime is imposing on Syrian prison. It's extremely, extremely hard to get any information from prisons, especially Sednaya. And I want to mention the very important work that Amnesty International, I believe, or Human Watch, the report that they released a few years ago, and the number of video that they released based on forensic architecture, which is based on stories of the detainees and the prisoners, and hearing the silences inside the prison. They were able to rebuild the architecture of the prison by listening to people being tortured and trying to figure out how far they were and what kind of instrument were being used, and so on and so forth. So check that report and get the information and be informed about what's happening in Syria. This is extremely important, and this panel is in part trying to do that. And thank you for voicing and talking about Syrian prisons and what people go through in Syrian prisons. This is an extremely powerful, I think, weapon against the Syrian regime, just voicing and telling people what is happening, that the story is not over. And if the Syrian regime is able to crush the visible aspect of the Syrian rebellion and is able to silence people, the struggle goes on, the violence in the Syrian prisons goes on, and we have to expose that. And we have to make alliances and build network and work with others to expose the crimes of the Syrian regime. I want to go back to you, Rateb, to ask the same question. You obviously are from a different generation and saw the prison system before the Syrian revolution, and obviously you know and are informed very well about prison today in Syria. So what is your advice to people? How can they be helpful? How can they get information? What are some of the simple things that they could do to be part of this network that is growing, to expose the prison system and to talk about the prison system? And I believe there is also a question I want to put on the screen for you to answer if you'd like. This is Akham Sha'ar, and he says, "Thank you so much for your intellectually challenging talk. I'd like to ask you if you believe there is a direct economic incentive for the regime in imprisonment, extortion, bribes from families." So if you could also talk about that aspect, address this question.
Thank you, Yasser. As for what we can do for the prisoners and for their question, I think what Wafa has said is quite correct in my point of view. At least we have to speak about them. We have to let their question alive. To forget them, this is the most dangerous case we can reach. So we have to mention them, to do any activities that can let their question alive. As for the question, in fact, the catastrophe that the Syrian people suffer are something that others can benefit of. So, in fact, the prisoners, their news, their cases were always something to be solved, and bribes are very common in prisons. in my epoch. I think nowadays the situation is far more worse than when I was in prison. And what is worse now is that the families of detainees, they pay to get some news of their beloved ones, but at last they get nothing. So, so the corruption in this regard is still there and is aggravating more and more. So I think the organizations that concentrate on the question of prisoners, of detainees, of disappeared, are a very good thing to do. And the political organizations must support these organizations also, because we are defending people who are in danger and they can't do anything for themselves. So we must defend them, otherwise they are alone under a regime that don't respect any value in their life.
Thank you so much, Rateb. And thank you for very informative responses and for sharing your narratives and your stories and experiences with the prison system in Syria, and for sharing information about how to be active and connect with the different groups organizing around those issues. Thank you for a very powerful and inspiring talk, and for answering our questions. I would like to remind our viewers of our next panel, which is next Wednesday, and it's titled "Where Next for the Syrian Struggle," and that's Wednesday, August 5th at 2 p.m. And I would like to thank Sarah Ajli-Yaqeen, who was streaming today's panel, and Robin Johns and Razan Ghazawi and Lara Al-Khatib, who organized this panel, and also the people who were organizing this webinar series, Ashley Smith, in addition to those who organized this panel today, Ashley Smith, Danny Postel, Joseph Daher, Lubna Mar'i, Malik Ramzi, Shireen Akram Busha'ar. And we hope to continue exposing the Syrian regime and talking about grassroots voices and grassroots struggles and politics. And we hope people will watch this program later on, and will watch our next and final panel next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for you, yes. Thank you for Robin and Sarah, and thank you for you all.
Thank you.